welcome to Literary Prospects, where we talk to authors and other literary professionals about books, publishing, and their writing life. I'm Kelley Vick, the host of the program, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest, author Samantha Hunt.
Samantha Hunt is the author of 5 books: The Seas, about a girl who might be a mermaid; The Dark Dark, a collection of short fiction; Mr. Splitfoot, a ghost story; The Invention of Everything Else, about inventor Nikola Tesla; and most recently, The Unwritten Book, a nonfiction investigation into our relationships with the dead. Samantha is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship, the Bard Fiction Prize, the National Book Foundation's 5 Under 35 Prize, and the St. Francis College Literary Prize. And she was a finalist for the Orange Prize and the PEN Faulkner. She's mother to 3 and sister to 5, a gardener, a beekeeper, a wild swimmer, a singer, a walker, and a forest enthusiast living in New York's Hudson Valley. Samantha Hunt, it is an absolute pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining today. You've authored 3 novels, a collection of short stories, and most recently, a work of nonfiction called The Unwritten Book, an investigation. The New York Times Book Review calls The Unwritten Book a provocative meditation on family and haunting. Booklist says it's an ardent investigation into life, love, death, and creativity, a literary performance of uncommon perception, vitality, daring, and heart. LitHub says, part literary criticism, part memoir, part family history, this new book explores the things that have a hold on us. And Kirkus Review calls it a vulnerable, wide-ranging, and at times deeply affecting patchwork of ruminations on the unknown. So how would you describe The Unwritten Book?
I'm always really bad at describing my own books, and so I was listening attentively to hear what people say to what you just read. The way that I thought about The Unwritten Book was like, for me, it started as just kind of collecting a bunch of things that I think of as hauntings. And by hauntings, I don't think necessarily of, sure, dead people, but not necessarily. I just kind of feel like a haunting is anything that that we have in our bodies that we can't get rid of, whether that's for the good or for the bad. It could even be just like a pop song that you can't get out of your ear, or just things that stay with you that you can't get rid of. And so then the question, like, well, why can't we get rid of them? What are they doing inside of us? And so that was how I thought of this collection in the beginning. A big part of that book is that there's 3 chapters from a book that my dad never finished writing because he died, a novel that he never finished writing. I didn't actually, when I was starting the book, I didn't actually realize that those 3 chapters were going to be part of this project at all. I'd always had them because he died when I was pretty young. So I had these 3 chapters, and I kind of had some inclination that, oh, I should finish writing his book, and when I would look at it and think about how does this book end, the most true thing I can say about that is that I was like, well, I don't know how it ends, and I can't ask him because he's dead. And that was like the greatest truth about our relationship with the dead that I could arrive at, like to try to fill in those blanks would be to somehow diminish the truth of his existence. And I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to diminish the mystery around death. I did kind of start off on this project with the idea about, like, how can death stop hurting me so much? How can I change my way of thinking about the dead? How can I change my way of thinking about death into a place where it wouldn't hurt me so much? And a lot of this book was written during COVID, so that seemed like a pretty important project at the time, since all of us were losing people, really frequently.
Yeah. What made you decide to step outside of fiction for this book?
Well, I have to say, quite honestly, I've never really been um, a person who believes in those divisions or really participates in those divisions in the first place. And so to me, it didn't seem any great stretch of the imagination at all to, if this book wanted to be classified as nonfiction. I mean, I guess I kind of understand that for our booksellers that they need those classifications. But I think that I would rather see just here's all the Samantha Hunt books together in this section, or here's all the, whoever the author may be, um, books together. And when I was at my work as a teacher and my work when I was a student, I never made those distinctions. I felt like I was learning from any text. And I also don't, I think it gets dangerous when we think about fiction as being untruthful, right? I mean, or we have some idea that it's lies, or I don't know, that's not really a helpful way for me to think about fiction at all, especially when I consider how fiction feels in my own body. Like fiction for me as a young reader was all I read. And it very much made me who I am. And so there's no sense for me that, fiction doesn't have a very real impact, or it doesn't
Mhm.
have, very tangible material result. And so um, I think also I'm married to a journalist. And so that idea about truth is something that I kind of, I think about a lot, and when I see how news is mitigated or negotiated, and there's a lot of untruth in nonfiction all the time.
Mhm.
Or I shouldn't say untruth, there's a lot of non-facts in nonfiction all the time. And so it wasn't, all this to say, it wasn't a really big step for me to write work that's nonfiction, because when I work on fiction, when I work on short stories, even when I write poetry or screenplay, whatever it is, it's not that I feel I myself am removed from the truth of what I'm writing. I
Mhm.
experience the world, and then I create characters that can hopefully relate some of that truth. And so, yeah, sorry, that's such a long answer, but I
It's a
don't really
great
have
answer.
distinctions.
It's a great, well, and you're not a fan of linear structure, right?
It's
Can
not
you
that I'm
talk
not a
about that
fan.
a bit?
It's not that I'm not a fan. I admire people who can do it. I just can't. Um, I just, yeah, that's not really the way that I've ever composed work, and it's not really the way. I do love to read things that don't put a chronological, you know, order on things necessarily. I think that also comes out of the idea of thinking about these questions about a truthful representation. When I'm walking down the street and I pass a bakery, say, for example, and I smell something, and suddenly my memory is carrying me back to, a time when I was 5 years old, or, a story that somebody told me, or something that I read. That that's my reality every day. That's everybody's reality every
Mhm.
day. And yet we try to act as if we're walking on a straight path, and as if we're walking on a straight narrative that starts at the beginning and goes to the end. That's not really true about what our experience as us as cognizant, thinking, feeling beings moving through the world is.
Mhm.
So for me, when a tangent interrupts my thinking, whether that's in the writing or whether that's in my teaching, I need to permit for that, and I need to allow for that, because I feel like that's an exciting structure in the way that our minds work, that they're synaptic and dimensional, not linear.
Mhm.
That we do move from thought to thought to thought. and that it's often a three-dimensional shape that our thoughts are in, and not a straight line at all. So I try to reflect that in the writing.
Yeah. How does that work when you're working on a novel? Well, Mr. Splitfoot, for example, which is an interesting one because it's sort of about that circle and cyclical and blurred lines between life and death, as it were. But it's also this great mystery, and there's tension, and you're still propelling your reader forward through the story. So how do you do that? How do you sort of balance that way of thinking and then the actual like structure of the piece? Does that make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely. And I would say, Mr. Splitfoot is really an example where I was trying to be more conscious of that straightforward line. I mean, the narrative there, or at least one of the narratives, is two women taking a walk that has a very distinct start and finish,
Mhm.
right? They're heading somewhere. You don't necessarily know where they're going in the beginning, but one of them knows where they're going. And it's like almost this sense of, uh, direct, there's something pulling them there, and so you do have a sense of a narrative. At the same time, I wanted to allow for those characters to also have that moment of like, wait, but this, when I'm thinking back and remembering what happened 20 years ago, how is that affecting us right now? um, and so, yeah, so for me in constructing that book, well, first of all, I should say about that book that I always envisioned it as two separate novels. There's two separate narratives told in that book, and my fantasy was that they were going to be bound back to back like this, and that a reader would have to flip, and read one chapter from one side and one chapter from the other. The publishing company didn't have that same
Cool.
vision that I did for that in the final work, and so it alternates chapters between the two different narratives now, which I end up liking. The reason I loved the idea of two bound back to back is that both narratives end at the same place, and it's up a mountaintop. And so I kind of loved the idea of the shape of the book is like, both of these narratives that
Mhm.
are at two totally different times leading to a mountaintop where, this is like my thriller book, right? There's like a big reveal. And it takes both narratives, the present moment and the past moment, for a reader to understand that moment of reveal, and what has happened. And it also, like, there's a joy for me in thinking about the way that time gets overlaid
Mhm.
different times. There's a Canadian artist whose work has affected me quite a bit. Her name is Janet Cardiff, and she does walks, sound walks. And one that I went on was in Central Park in New York, and anybody can take it. It's part of public art fund. You just have to have headphones and your phone with you or something. But she layers time in that in such a wonderfully creepy, active way, so that whenever you're taking the walk, you feel the time that she took the walk. You feel the time that other people who she's telling you stories about have walked. And so there's this real sense of a simultaneity of all moments when you're engaged in that piece. And her work has always really shaped a lot of the work that I do as a writer. And so I think in Mr. Splitfoot, I was trying to have that same sense of all times being present, and it especially becomes really important. And same thing in the Unwritten Book too, when we're thinking about hauntings, when we are thinking about the way places get um, textured or layered with meaning or hauntings. Um, and it has to do with this. It has to do that we exist. We live in spaces that have a history, right? And whether we acknowledge it or not, that history is oftentimes affecting us quite vividly. And so, with Mr. Splitfoot flipping back and forth like that, I love the idea that there's moments in that text that it's almost like you feel like as a reader you're scraping through the surface and you can almost see the other story underneath.
Mm-hmm.
Those are my favorite moments in that book, when you're like, when you hear an echo of the time before, or even hear an echo of the future time. um that's kind of was my favorite thing, when I could make that happen in that book.
And it works so beautifully. I'm was sitting there reading it. How does she do this? It's so great.
Thank you.
um, you have a book called I think it's the Dictionary of Word Origins that you use kind of like an
It's right
oracle.
over there on the shelf. I'm looking. Yep, there it is.
How does it work? How does it work?
Do you want me to go? Let me go grab it. One
Sure,
second.
yeah.
It's this beautiful. Yeah. So this was my dad's book, but I didn't really get into it until after my dad was dead.
Mhm.
But it's an amazing dictionary that Joseph T. Shipley, who's the author of it, it's a dictionary of word origins, and he does a lot of storytelling through the definitions. So, I mean, you see, it's set up just like a dictionary.
Mhm.
Um, but then he'll do these kind of works of reference. I mean, okay, this is just completely random that I opened to the page between the K and the L. I see he has all of these reference words, like he'll send you to another one, and so it says laggard, see coward, Ku Klux Klan, see circus. And so there's some
Wow.
moments like that, I know, and you're like, wait, what does the circus have to do with the KKK?
Mhm.
And there's moments that I'm like, oh, let's go follow that up and turn to circus and see what it has to do with it. But then there's also moments where I just use the book and I'm like, yeah, okay.
Mhm.
I'm not gonna follow up on the reference. Like, I already know, what the why that has to do with the circus. And so he has these incredible. It's like he's like a poet, right?
Mhm.
Hashish, see assassin. I actually know that story. That story is incredible, why those are related. Um, and so I love, I love a work of reference that's supposedly an authority that has so many holes in it, that has like so much room for somebody who has an inclination towards poetry to kind of slip in there and be like, whoa, how are these things related? I mean, because the truth of this dictionary then becomes like, everything is relational, everything is about relation, and everything is about story. And I love it that this kind of authority on words, acknowledges that in this work of reference.
How do you use it as when you're sitting down to write? Do you just open it to a page, or how does
I used it
come
a
in?
lot in when I was writing the Unwritten Book, that it almost kind of functions as an oracle,
Mhm.
where if there's some word that you're obsessing over, for whatever project it might be, I would oftentimes look it up and see, um, and it becomes like a fortune teller, or the same way that you can use people who use things like tarot or horoscope, as directional pointers. I don't really use those things that much, but I definitely use this book as that, that, like,
Fantastic.
what does Shipley tell me about this, right?
I need to get a copy to keep on my bookshelf. You've inspired me in more ways than one. But you in the Unwritten Book, there are a lot of images as well. And it's quite the family affair. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah, so there's pictures in there. I mean, one of my biggest influences is Zabald. And so I always loved how he used photos in his work. And at first I was collecting images and photos for this, um, and had thrown them in and had sent them off to my editor. And she felt like they were so disparate in so many different formats and things. And she wondered, what if we just tried to have an illustrator translate all of these images? So my mom's an artist, so I was like, great, this is kind of a family book. I'll ask her to do the sketches, and she did, like, this was a photo of my great aunts. They used to sit in the maple tree, and so she rendered them. But then a lot of the images were things that involved my daughters and my uncle. And so once I had some of the sketches from my mom, I was like, well, wait, why doesn't everyone just do their own, the picture that is relevant to them, you know? And so I asked each of my daughters, I have 3 daughters, I asked them each to do some of the illustrations. And my uncle's been dead since he was a child, but I have his illustrations. And so I threw those in there as well. Yeah. Oh, here's my uncle's illustrations. They're incredible.
They're
I
so
don't know if you can
great.
see them, but he just had such an incredible sensibility. He says he has one little drawing of a boat, and it says, "This is a boat to remind you of a song." Ooh, I love that.
So good.
Yeah, so good, right? I know. There's like the Joseph T. Shipley in my uncle. Yeah, so that makes me really happy to have, and also like I like the fact that they're not professional. I like
Hmm.
the fact that they're not professional, and that they're like not by one artist, that they're by 5 different artists, and that they're all my family members too. It felt like a nice way to kind of be truthful about the beauty and non-perfection.
Is there a big question that you find yourself coming back to time and time again throughout your work?
Um, I think for many years, my questions have been, surrounding our relationship to death. Um, when I was writing the Unwritten Book, I kind of became interested in the cross section of like where our questions about death and our questions about reading intersect. You know, what does the library have to do with the dead?
Mhm.
And there's a lots of ways that the library has to do with the dead. Um, After the Unwritten Book, and I guess always also is, it's not that I've answered those questions or I'm done with those questions in any way, shape, or form, but I think that one question that I've added into that mix is also like, okay, um, like the question about the library, the question about the dead, and now I'm kind of throwing in a question about the forest and nature, and like what do these 3 realms, how do they intersect, how do they overlap? I mean, and then on top of all of that too, a lot of my work has been centered around the female experience. I guess I am moving out of that a little bit more. um that I've been exploring female experience a lot, because I have these 3 daughters and
Mhm.
3 sisters, and and I'm a woman. Uh, but hopefully, I think the new work is a little more like thinking about humans' roles in the natural world, in the library, and and questions of life and death. So that's a lot of questions. Sorry, that's not one
No,
specific
that's but
question.
it's they're in the same going down the same road, I think. Well, or dancing around the same circle. Um,
Do you have one question that you investigate? I always think it's really great if we can have one question, but sometimes it's hard.
I don't think so, or maybe I do, and I don't know what it is yet. I mean, maybe if I like sat there and tried to collect everything together, I could say, but I sort of feel like I'm all over the place, but maybe not. You know.
Mhm.
Probably not. I guess most of us are really not if we get right down to it. Um, you talked about the Unwritten Book being about hauntings in a way, and you have said that the house that you grew up in is a haunted house. Um, can you speak a little more as to what you mean by that exactly?
Sure. Yeah, it's not haunted. Like, oh, now I got a bee in here too.
Oh.
Got all these animals in here with me. It's not haunted in that there's ghosts at all. Like, there's not this like, "Ugh." I'm never scared in that house. It's not scary. It doesn't feel bad at all. But it's definitely haunted by history and that layering of time that we spoke about. And it's also kind of a pretty magical, weird place. I was just there. My mom still lives in the house where I grew up. And she has a lot of stuff because she's lived there for so long.
Mhm.
And so there is a sense when one visits, that you can dig through time, or you can access all times there. Um, there's also a sense that the house kind of produces magical things. Not magical things, but presents things to you, maybe when you need them, or when you are looking for something, or even when you're not looking for something. Um, I mean, this is like the dumbest example ever, but I was just up there because she had to have some medical procedures and I was trying to help her, and just, taking out time to go and be with her and to clean up her house for her and whatever, assist her.
Mhm.
And as I was leaving, I was like looking around, and suddenly I saw at the end of the bed there was just a pair of pants, and I held them up and I was like, these are perfectly my size and they're really nice. And I was like, Ma, whose pants are these? She's like, I don't know, if you want them, you can have them. And so I was like, thank you, house. Thank you, house.
Where
Like,
did they
I
come
almost felt
from?
like the house was being like, oh, you took care of her. Here you go. Kelley Link has this amazing story called The Summer House. I don't know if you ever read that story, The Summer House, but the house, or the residents who you don't really see, who are magical people, creatures, they give the narrator gifts all the time. And sometimes when that happens in my mom's house, I think of that Kelley Link story. I'm like, thank you, house. And so it's definitely haunted in that way. It's also really old for America. It was built in 1765, and so it's hard to not sit there and wonder, okay, like what other families have lived here, and what were their lives like. So it's haunted in the way that it just makes you stop and think about other lives beyond your own.
You mentioned the Kelly Ling story. Do you have a favorite haunted house type story? Would that be the one, or is there
I
another?
love I love that one. I love Amparo de Villa's The House Guest. I don't know if that's the house that's so much haunted. I mean, it's haunted by a spirit.
Mhm.
Um, I love Mariana Enrique's Adea's House. Uh, I should have thought about more haunted house stories, but those three I really do love. I mean, Kelley's story is not necessarily scary, and I like that about it. Like, I love the idea of haunted house stories that are more eerie than scary.
Mhm.
Uh, but yeah, those three are pretty important to me: Amparo de Villa, Mariana Enrique, and Kelley Link.
To me, your story, a love story, feels like a
Mm.
haunted house story. It's a story of a middle-aged woman, new mother who's moved out of the city to a new house in the country, and at night, while she's obsessively worrying over her children and her marriage, she's haunted by these ghosts, in a sense, of other women she's encountered in her life. Were you thinking about it like that when you wrote it, or?
Well, I don't. Okay, so there's two versions of that story. There's the one that appeared in the New Yorker, and then there's the one that appears in the Dark Dark. The one that appears in Dark Dark has more of those haunting women,
Mhm.
and each one of them is assigned a hormone. The name of a hormone comes before their story, and so I was definitely thinking about hormones as something that haunts us.
Mhm.
In fact, the Unwritten Book has a chapter. Wait, now I'm getting confused. I think there's a chapter called Hormones in the Unwritten Book. I
Mhm.
can check, but
Mhm.
that was one of the original hauntings for me, was thinking about hormones. I mean, I had a super hard time with postpartum anxiety, and and it really felt like being haunted. It felt like being cursed by hormones in some way, and like there was something foreign in my body that I wanted out. And so that story very much came out of that idea of being haunted. I mean, and certainly whenever we're talking about haunted houses, it's hard to not think about a biological
Mhm.
haunting, right? That this is the house I really live in, this
Mhm.
this frame right here. And so Oh, there's an incredible line in The Immigrants, in Sebald's The Immigrants, where he's describing people who live in houses that have had servants, and he's talking about that creepy idea of people moving inside the walls behind, without you necessarily knowing it. And I
Mhm.
remember that one of the first times I read that piece, I started thinking about that idea of like these servants that creep through our body, like thinking about hormones as servants, and because it
Wow.
has that same quality of being like, yes, they're helpful. Yes, hormones are extremely helpful, but they also can have a malicious um, residue, or a malicious intent, like that they're almost trying to sabotage the body that they live in, or sometimes it feels like that, especially
Mhm.
the female form, probably within the male form too, when, in situations of aggression or violence or anger, it can feel like a haunting for sure. And so, yeah, so a love story was really, it was thinking about a haunting, but the house that was being haunted was like an individual body, more than a house. But even, how that body then projects into the home that this family is living in, right?
Mhm.
That things start happening. Things
Mhm.
start happening in that house that you're not sure which level of reality, um, you know, things are transpiring on.
What is it about, I know you said you're moving more into the natural world now, but, what is it about mothers and motherhood that particularly, has interested you as a literary subject?
I mean, a lot of what I was just saying, like that notion of having a foreign body inside your body is a
Mhm.
really interesting place to be. And that sense of like having carried these humans that are here now. I mean, my daughters are all teenagers now, and are so like really different than I am. That's amazing. It's incredible to me, that that you can make something from the very cells of your body that ends up being so totally different than you. It's wonderful, but it's also spooky. It's also pretty spooky. And that's not a narrative that we get to hear so much about. There's so many pat stupid ideas about what motherhood means. And so when I started writing about motherhood, approximately 16 years ago, um, it was really to investigate some of these ideas about the, not, I don't mean to say the bad side of mothering, because that's not what I mean, but I mean more like, I was fascinated in the ways that we don't tell the truth about motherhood, and whether that's negative experiences with it, which people are starting to tell the truth about that, but um, and again, that's not the fault of the child or the mother. It's like living in a society that doesn't understand mothering is at the fault there, but also to kind of to explore the idea of how powerful it is to be a mother, instead of reducing mothers to kind of like harried, overwhelmed, nagging creatures. And so I really started thinking about the idea. It was before I was a mom. My sister became a mom, and I said to her, "Oh, you just made a death." I didn't really mean to say it. I guess I shouldn't have. And she's also really sensitive, and she got super upset. But I kind of meant it as like, "Whoa, that's really badass of you. Like you made a death." I'm like, "You're the maker of life and death," is what I meant. And so started thinking about that narrative as as mothers, as having pretty powerful situation of being the makers of death. That sounds, I know that most people will think that's a negative take on motherhood, but I don't mean it as that. I just meant it as a powerful thing.
It sounds powerful. It sounds powerful when you explain it like that. I was like, "Oh, mothers as kind of gods in a way."
Well, and that's partly why I also became really intent on dealing with creating for myself a new relationship with death, because I didn't the vulnerability of becoming a mom and to have to worry about the guilt of having made three deaths, and just like the obsession of trying to keep these babies alive, uh, really did a lot to kind of mm, did a lot that was not positive for me, brought me so much anxiety. And so a lot of the project behind the Unwritten Book came out of that too, about trying to find a new narrative for death that was not as scary or as sad as the one that I think that I had been operating under.
You've also said that the tyranny of normalcy is one of your favorite topics.
Yeah,
What do
that's
you
true. That's
mean?
true. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I have to say, even that I had some new thinking on lately, but my thoughts about the tyranny of normalcy really came out of being a mom and like trying to understanding that my children wanted me to not they wanted to fit in.
Hmm.
They wanted to fit in. And I grew up in a house where I already didn't fit in, like, grew up in an alcoholic home. Everybody knew that was the truth about my family, and because I lived in a really small town. And so I had a bunch of brothers and sisters who were my support and my friends, and that was good. I was good with that. And so I've never worried so much about having to fit in. I already knew I didn't. My parents were artists and writers. It just wasn't going to happen. And so then to start that cycle over again and to have daughters who actually wanted to not be, outsiders or not be weirdos in our community was really hard for me, because I was like, wait, but the outsiders are the people who can think clearly. And um, I have to say, seeing what times my daughters have had to live through, this is the change in that thinking that I've had, is that I do feel like there's actually maybe something admirable in them desiring an idea of being normal, that has to do with, preserving mental health,
Hmm.
and keeping a community of support around them. And for that, I do admire the idea of the normalcy. But I think the biggest reason that I get frustrated with this, the kind of the tyranny of normalcy, is that it's just not true. There's nobody who's normal. I think it's like the most hateful idea that you're ever going to find someone who's normal, and so trying to ask people to conform to ideas of normalcy is really just capitalism in disguise. It's really just like the evilest way that capitalism gets to us. Like, if you do not purchase this, you will not be normal, and then your kids will be outcasts. And I mean, and you see that happening certainly everywhere in America. And so I think a lot of that, like the idea about rejecting that sort of tyranny, had to do with like teaching my daughters to be suspicious of capitalism.
Do you believe in ghosts?
Um, well, that's a tricky question. I've never seen a ghost myself, but there's people who I trust very much and love very much who have seen ghosts, and so I would never want to discount. I mean, and also, what do we mean by ghost, right?
Well,
Like, yeah, that's one thing I get into in the Unwritten Book. I'm like, is a postcard a ghost? Is a bruise a ghost? Is a book a ghost? And yeah, I mean, I would answer yes to all of those questions, because they have that same feeling. But I think normally when we see ghosts, we mean like a dead person appearing as an apparition, right? And so that's never happened to me, but I can tell you one story that's made me believe that it happens, that I wrote about in the Unwritten Book. I don't know if this is a spoiler or not, but when my daughters were one daughter or two daughters were 2 years old and one was 5 years old. None of them were readers. None of them had started school yet. we were driving and there was a roadside memorial for a young man who had died, and the memorial said Billy on it. And we stopped at the light, and my oldest daughter said, "What's that?" And I was like, didn't want to say anything because it was so sad. It was clearly somebody's son had died. And so I hesitated a moment, I paused a moment, and in that time that I paused, one of my 2-year-olds said, "That's where William died." Now, she didn't know how to read. She didn't know that Billy was a nickname for William. And so my husband and I said, "How did you know that?" And she said that the robot in her head told her.
Wow.
So after that happened, I was a little bit like, all right.
Okay.
I was like, definitely children talk to dead people.
Oh, that just gave me chills. And I've read the book, but still just hearing you tell the story gives me chills.
I
Well,
do think that kids have, I mean, I have to say all 3 of my daughters had things when they were young that you're like, and I think that, maybe they're more open to that, and then as they stay here in this realm, they shut it down for whatever reason. And maybe there's some people who don't shut it down with the same, finality that the rest of us do.
well, that segues very well into what my next question was, which is that you got a blurb for from Mr. Splitfoot from Charlotte Bronte. So how'd you get that?
Oh yeah, I did. Well, okay, so Mr. Splitfoot, part of it is really about mediums, and there's a bunch of fake mediums in that book, who just enjoy like the idea of storytelling and taking people's money for it and pretending to talk to the dead. So I was like, all right, well, a lot of my research involved going to mediums. And so when it came time to get blurbs, I was like, oh, I know what I want to do, because I hate getting blurbs. I hate it. It's like, I don't know. It's terrible having to ask your friends and your colleagues to like do free work, and I don't know, the whole process. I guess I understand it, but it bothers me. So I went to a medium. I brought a picture of Charlotte Bronte, and I asked the medium basically, what does this lady think about this book? And that was the blurb I got. And the whole process was really funny because I kept seeing how the medium really wanted to make a narrative, and halfway through the reading I realized like, oh, she and I have the exact same job. She's just like trying to observe and make a narrative out of me, because she kept on trying to be like, is your husband romantic, like asking all these questions that had nothing to do with it. I'm like, I'm not here about my husband at all. I'm like, come on. I'm like, let's stick to the task here. And so she gave me a blurb from Charlotte Bronte, and my press let me use it, and I was so glad they did.
I love it. You say you've never written a book that doesn't contain reference to at least one book that does not exist.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I love the idea of thinking about ghost libraries, or the libraries of books that never got to exist, and whether it's, especially like, part of my obsession with Sebald is that he died young, and and in a car accident. So it was like he was gonna write more books, and that was so hard for me to accept. And so that kind of started my obsession with that idea about the fake books, uh, after Sebald died in 2001. And then my own dad dying too young, and thinking about that idea of like, well, what books would he have written? What book? And even just knowing my own process, that there's a lot of books that I'm not going to get to write. There's a lot of books that I'm not going to get to write, and so I love thinking about the idea of the ghost libraries and the ghost books and all of the books that don't exist in many different ways. And so in each of my books, I do tuck in a book that doesn't exist. I had the strangest experience. The writer Ed Park, who I'm also a humongous fan of, and he's got a new book coming out very soon this fall, Same Bed, Different Dream, that is incredible. But he kept he kept tabs on this invisible library, and he has a collection. It exists online, of all the books that don't exist that appear in all of our favorite works of literature. Um, but he alerted me. Oh no, it wasn't Ed. I'm sorry, it was Brian Evanson. But Ed has this amazing invisible library. But Brian Evanson, who has this kind of photographic memory, he contacted me once and said, one of the fake authors who I came up with was in The Invention of Everything Else. That's my book about Nikola Tesla. I made this author named Wanda LaFontaine. And Brian reached out to me because he was like, hey, Lucius Shepard also has made reference to Wanda LaFontaine in his books. And I keep looking for this author. I'd like to read her, but I can't find her. And I was like, I made her up, And so I reached out to Lucius Shepard because I thought, oh, this is so crazy. How funny that we both invented the same fake author. And right, I didn't hear from Lucius. And about 2 weeks after I had reached out to him, Ed Park sent me a text and said that, did you just see that Lucius Shepard died this morning? And he died really young. He was only 70. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I don't know, I almost felt responsible, like I had exposed this library, this secret library, or this secret world. And I mean, clearly I'm not responsible for this man I've never met before's death, mm-hmm. but I somehow felt entangled in it in some way. And so I'm always fascinated. And I can't help it. I always like the sad songs too. Like there's a real melancholy in those books that don't get written. And so when Lucius died, I started thinking, of course, then about all the books that now he will not be able to write. And so it just felt like, that library just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And so I kind of throw those books into every single book that I write, I guess, as a memorial to our dead.
Beautiful. How is the process of writing a short story different from writing a novel or longer piece for you? When you get an idea and you sit down to write, do you know, like, this is going to be a short story or this is going to be something longer?
Yeah, I usually know that it's going to be a short story. And I guess it goes back to what we were talking about earlier when you were saying, that I don't really practice linearity very well. But there is a sense of, a number of different things coming into the pot to inform it, right? And so most often when I'm working on something, I start with, 2 or 3 or 4 different things that I can't figure out how they connect to each other, and I want to figure out how they connect to each other. So it's almost like throwing them into the boxing match together and seeing how they are going to duke it out. And so I think it really has to do with just how many elements I'm wrestling with in a piece that makes me know whether it's a novel or a short story, because that's really, I love to start with that tension of not knowing how the parts of a piece are related. That's kind of what keeps the writing process alive for me, is like trying to figure that out. Mm-hmm. And it means that sometimes there's some stories that don't make it because I don't figure it out. I'm like, I guess these things don't have anything to say to each other. But yeah, I generally know pretty clearly from the beginning. And right now, like, I'm working on both a short story collection and a novel. And there was a long part that I thought it was a short story, and it just kept getting longer and longer and longer. And, and I actually cannibalized that story for the novel. The story still exists now, but I had to take out a big chunk of it, and I put it into the novel. And I guess because I'm always writing around the same questions, it is sometimes hard to know which part belongs where, because um, while the the books that I've made have all been distinct and different from each other, they all revolve around the same questions, like our relationship with nature, our relationship with science, our relationship with the dead, and our bodies. So I do find like there can be a lot of cross-referencing. There can be a lot of interplay between the parts. But generally, I know beforehand that something is a short story or something is a novel.
Have
It
you?
doesn't make it easier to write a short story, though. I wish I could say like, oh yeah, those just like come like that, but they don't. It probably takes me just as long to write a short story as it
I
does
was
a
just
novel.
about to say, how long does it take you to write a short story? Is there like,
Well,
is it?
there's a handful of them that come quickly, but that's not the majority. The majority of them take me years, which is why I work on multiple projects at the same time, because I don't know, I need to let them have some breathing room to like figure out where they're going, what they're about. And so, yeah, so I usually am working on 3 or 4 stories and a novel at the same time, or at least I am right now.
What do you think? Well, okay, I have a double-barreled question
Okay.
because they're similar, but to me, they're two different questions. What makes a good story? Number one, but number two, what makes a story work on the
Hmm.
page?
Oh boy, I wish I knew. I mean,
Well, it seems like you do.
thank you. For me, what makes a good story is I love stories that don't solve a mystery, but really just reveal further mystery.
Mhm.
I think that's partly why I love Sebald and Kelley Link and Murakami and writers like that, writers who just kind of are like, ooh, there's just more mystery, when we scrape away the mystery. Um, and so, yeah, so that would be something personal, but that's only for me, that's what makes a short story work. Um, and then, wait, what was the other part of the question? How to
Well,
make
what makes a good story
what
and
makes
and what makes it work on the page?
hmm. I mean, again, all I can speak to is what makes it work for me.
Yeah.
Um, and I think because of the way that I work with these different like um, nodes, or different parts or different fragments, is that I really love that experience of like when there's multiple fragments and you start to feel the electricity between them, and so it can almost start to feel like a story is charged, like there's actually a current because of different juxtapositions. And I think that current very much comes from a reader's mind. It has to do with like leaving space for my reader to have that interaction, to have that question like, well, what does, what do raincoats have to do with whatever? I don't know,
Mhm.
cupcakes, whatever it may be, like whatever the two things that I'm trying to create electricity between. Um, and so for me, it's kind of like it will reach a point where I can feel that current going through it, and I know like, okay, that's the end of it. That's where it goes. And it's not that it necessarily resolves, but that I can feel that there's a charge there.
Have you always written? And what was the road to publication like for you? That
Yeah. I have always written. I When I was younger, it wasn't like a formal practice at all, and that didn't really start until I well, I wrote in high school as a way, I mean, a lot of my writing for me is thinking. And so, yes, it's always been the way that I think is I write it. And then I can work through something. And so I did write in high school, but it wasn't until after I graduated college that I really started to, um, well, that's not totally true. I wrote some in college too, but I after college, I was kind of, I worked a bunch of miserable jobs. Um, I was a waitress for years. I worked in an envelope factory. I worked in a garment factory. And um, I hated having a boss so much. And I just felt after college like I really need to um, make this work. And um, so I started writing really a lot. And I would get up before work. Oh, I do have to say, the one job that I didn't hate where I had a boss was I worked at alternative news weeklies for years, especially I worked at 7 Days in Vermont. And those were the two best bosses I've ever had in my life. They were amazing. Um, Pamela and Tala, they were great. But and I learned so much from them. It was an awesome place to work. But I just really was like, okay, I gotta do this. And so I wrote the C's um in the early morning hours before going to work because I wanted to have time to do it. And so that started a practice for me of early morning writing, which I still continue to do 20 years later. Um, and the road to publication was long and arduous. Long and arduous. And this is back in the day before the internet. So it was a process of like printing out stories, putting them in manila envelopes, mailing them out to tiny magazines. And, slowly but surely, um, I started to have pieces in magazines, starting with just like really small college journals. And then McSweeney's was like the first bigger magazine, and the people at McSweeney's really helped me get started. They published a huge section, 80 pages of the C's before it was published. Wow. Yeah. And then I got an agent. And the one advice that I would give writers about getting an agent is my agent was just starting out at the same time that I was just starting out, and he was young, and we've grown up together. I was his first client. I was the first novel he ever sold. I was the first short story he ever sold to the New Yorker, and now he's a superstar agent. And it's a super meaningful relationship that we've kind of grown older together. And so I would urge people to look for agents who are also just starting their career, and to not go necessarily for, the superstar agents whose names you've heard, but to have faith in somebody who's just starting to build their client list. And he sold the C's to a small press in San Francisco that doesn't exist anymore, McAdam Cage. And that was the start of that.
What do you know now that you wish you had known then before you published that first novel?
Gosh. I mean, in a way, I wish that now I could unknow things that no, for real. I wish, well, first of all, I wish, a lot of the times I wish that the internet didn't exist, because I hate knowing so much about other writers' lives. I love knowing other writers' books, but I don't really feel like we should know each other's lives with the intimacy that we do now. I think that can be really hard to have all that knowledge about, um, what other writers are doing. And so I guess more I wish that I could unknow things the way, back when that book came out in 2004, I didn't know anything, and I just had these stories that I wanted to write, and it was in many ways a lot easier to write then than it is now. There's too much, you got to shut down some of that information if you're going to be able to understand what story it is you want to tell.
Okay, I have a traditional final question for you. The traditional final question is when your book is turned into a movie or series, what do you think the theme song should be?
Oh my gosh. This is so hard for me because I'm like a huge music nerd and a huge music fan. Oh boy, so to have to choose one is super hard.
And which book are we
Which
going to do? Unwritten Book, Mr. Splitfoot?
Mm. Okay, so I'm gonna cheat a little bit. So I just adapted The Yellow, which is a short story that's in the Dark Dark.
Uh-huh.
And it's being made into a short film right now. And it's a story about a dog that comes back to life because of like some weird sex that happens. And so
It's your normal story.
so the song that I don't think this is going to be able to happen, but the song that I think would be so perfect to have in these closing credits, because it's really, really creepy, that story. Like it ends, I shouldn't spoil how it ends, but it ends in this really creepy, like the woman turns out to be super creepy and she can't deal with mystery. So she tries to shut down that anything weird has happened. And she asks the man to like do this horrible, horrible thing at the end so that she can have some sort of deniability about mystery. But the song that I always thought would be so amazing, because I love movies that are creepy and then they end with like a happy, bright song. And so I always imagine the credits rolling to Engelbert Humperdinck's After the Lovin', you know, it's like, well, I do this song after the lovin'. And it's like this total like Vegas big number. And I thought, oh, that would be so creepy to have this guy like who's just standing there ruined by knowing too much about the world, have this really, really creepy song.
That is great. I love it. Samantha, thank you so much for being here and coming on. It's such a pleasure to get to talk to you.
Oh, thank you for having me, Kelley. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us on Literary Prospects. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see you next time.